What's wrong about, thinking that we need equal representation? What's the problem with this?
Well, okay. You catch me a little bit off guard here, but I'll try.
Okay.
It essentializes and reifies dimensions of our humanity to an excessive extent, and it doesn't. It's illiberal. It is not taking the individual person seriously at some level, and it's also not accurate as a social scientific. So there's a normative argument which I just made. It's the individual that should be the focus of any theory of justice that we elaborate, not groups. It's the individual. But there's also a question of, if we see disparities or we see social problems, to what extent are they actually the result of the forces invoked by the critical race theory? To what extent does identity really determine destiny in the society, and so on? And I think we talked about the police violence question specifically, and I've given my view. But I think if you talked about educational attainment, if you talked about the achievement of economic security, if you talked about wealth disparities, and so on, if you talked about underrepresentation in certain lines of business enterprise and all of that, that the systemic racism, white hegemonic domination, critical race theoretic framework doesn't actually give an account of the data. I mean, you gave reference just a moment ago to differences amongst various African descended immigrant populations in the UK in terms of what's actually happening. Their race is not what's distinguishing between Caribbean origin and West African origin UK second generation immigrant populations. It's not their race that's the issue. It's their culture, I'm inclined to think. That's not within the orbit of the critical race theoretic reflections. And there's a lot of stuff that's like that.
Glenn, we've got to wrap up in a moment, but there's one question that's just occurred to me that I want to ask you about. If we take the economic analysis that a lot of the problems in inner cities, in black neighborhoods in America, are the product of the economic circumstance in which those people find themselves, would it not be then reasonable to argue that that is the product of the various discriminatory laws that were in place in the United States, the genuine widespread racism that existed in the United States in the previous century, particularly, and obviously the consequences of slavery? Now, if I posit to you that that is a reasonable argument to make, is it not then quite logical to suggest that some form of reparations be made to address that and to help those communities up so that they can operate on a level playing field with everybody else?
It's not illogical. It's just mistaken, in my view. Let me explain why I think it's mistaken. I think it's a political misstep. I think it's the wrong way to frame the problem. I'm responding to you now by acknowledging, by stipulating that history casts a long shadow and that the history of racial oppression and exclusion in America is partly implicated in the disparities that we see today. I don't dispute that. And therefore, it is natural and logical to think that the right way to respond to that history is to monetize it in some sense and to make transfers to people based upon how they might be imagined to have been affected by that history. Here's why I think that that's a mistake. I don't think that there's a sum of money large enough to indemnify disadvantaged person, a person who didn't complete high school, who has very little skills, who has drug addiction problems, who has 3 or 4 kids and no husband, who is basically on the outs of society. I don't think there's a cash payment big enough to indemnify them from the consequences in their lives and their children's lives of what history has bequeathed to them. They've been dealt a very bad hand by history. I worry that reparations advocacy, should it succeed in bringing about $50,000 per head of cash transfers to African Americans. I know that there are many arguments about how reparations might be implemented. I just say that for the sake of concreteness, that it would guarantee that 5 years, 10 years, 30 years, 50 years from now, there would not still be jails overflowing with young Black men. There would not still be 70% of children born to a Black woman in this country born to a woman without a husband. There might still be 16-year-olds reading at the Blacks reading on average at the same level of proficiency as 12-year-old whites. That's the case today. I don't know that reparations would cause that situation to be different in 10, 20, or 50 years from now. However, what it would do is commodify the claim that African Americans have on the general public for attention to the problems that beset our communities. It would commodify it, and it would enact a transaction in which we will have been paid in compensation for what history has wrought. That is, I think, not a good situation to be in, to discharge the obligation. I would credit that there is a communal obligation to be especially attentive to the disadvantage suffered by African Americans. I would advocate for programs of intervention aimed at reducing the most deleterious effects of that sort. But I would object to sitting across a bargaining table with the rest of America. We have our moral capital on one side. They have their money on the other side. We push our moral capital into the middle of the table. They push these chits over to us on the other side. And then we're done. The ability to command the society's attention to the certain to be ongoing social maladies afflicting Black America will have been significantly diminished. Better, far better, in my opinion, more moral and also more politically effective, is to take our moral capital, combine it with the influence of others on behalf of the creation of a decent social contract for all Americans, and get that implemented. If that's implemented, bad schools in Black neighborhoods will get attention. Jails overflowing with Black people will come to be a big social issue. The needs of families, et cetera, employment issues, et cetera, will be attended to. They'll be attended to for all Americans, and therefore they will be attended to for Black Americans. Don't try to cut a separate deal with America, is my message to Black people. That is a mistake.